They laughed when I wiped marinara sauce off my wife's face in the middle of a packed restaurant. What they didn't know was that the second I pulled out my phone and made one quiet call, their entire world started coming apart at the seams. Welcome back to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you are going to need a heavy dose of justice by the time this story ends. Ask anyone in Charleston who knows me, and they'll tell you my name is Thomas. I am 64, a retired commercial real estate attorney. My wife Eleanor says I possess only two emotional settings, calm or asleep. We have been married 38 years. More than 13,000 mornings of waking up next to the exact same woman and thinking I would choose her all over again. Eleanor is the finest human being I have ever known. So understand my devastation when I say what happened on a Friday night on King Street nearly broke something in me permanently. Our son Julian was 34. We raised him right, paying for his college in full. Then Chloe entered his life. At first, she seemed sharp and ambitious. Within months, her confidence morphed into calculated cruelty. She would cut Eleanor off, roll her eyes, and make snide remarks about my wife being exhausting. And Julian, my own boy, let it happen every time, trading his spine for a quiet house. That fragile balance exploded on a Friday at an exclusive King Street venue. After 40 minutes of forced conversation, Chloe slid her phone across the table toward Eleanor. On the screen was a message from Eleanor's sister Beatrice, sent months prior after Chloe had publicly humiliated my wife. "Don't treat my sister that way again." Chloe weaponized it. Her voice cut across the dining room, demanding to know why Eleanor was poisoning her marriage. Eleanor looked stricken, explaining she had only confided out of hurt. When Chloe looked to Julian for backup, my son uttered the unforgivable. "She has a point, Mom. You've been causing a lot of stress." The tables around us fell silent. Eleanor looked at her son, softly whispering, "I didn't mean it that way." She never finished. Chloe stood, grabbed a ceramic bowl of leftover pasta fra diavolo in thick red marinara, and poured it directly over my wife's head. The sauce dripped down Eleanor's silver hair and sky-blue blouse. But Chloe wasn't finished. Leaning over the table, she let out a venomous laugh, raising her voice so every VIP guest and manager could hear, "Look at this pathetic trash from the working-class gutters. This is what happens when uneducated nobodies try to sit at our table." As Eleanor sat trembling, Chloe pointed at Julian. "Stand up right now, Julian. Clap for me. Stand up and applaud to prove whose side you're on, or we are completely done." And right there, my son stood up. He lowered his eyes and began a weak, trembling applause to prove his loyalty. The restaurant gasped in disgust, but I didn't scream. I stood up, pulled the white linen napkin from my lap, and walked around to Eleanor's side. I gently wiped the marinara sauce from her face, treating her with the devotion of a man ready to burn the world down to protect her. I helped her up, buttoned her coat over her ruined blouse, and walked her past the staring crowd out into the warm Charleston night. Behind us, Chloe laughed triumphantly, completely unaware that the quiet man she had just mocked had already made one single phone call, and their entire empire was about to crumble. We got into the car without a word. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed Marcus Hale immediately. Marcus answered on the second ring, his familiar, gravelly voice cutting through the heavy silence of the vehicle. He was 58 years old, possessed the sharpest legal mind in Charleston County, and had been my closest friend since our undergraduate days at the University of South Carolina back in 1981. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or descriptions of the restaurant scene. I simply said 3 quiet words and told him precisely what needed to be done at first light. Marcus didn't ask what happened, nor did he express shock. He just let out a slow, heavy breath and asked, "All of it?" I answered affirmatively, hung up, and concentrated on driving my wife home through the quiet streets of Mount Pleasant. Eleanor didn't break down or shed a single tear until we were crossing the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge, perhaps a mile from our house. Stopped at a red light, she made a quiet, involuntary sound, like something she had been holding deep inside for months finally slipping loose. I reached across the center console, took her hand, and held it tightly. I didn't offer empty platitudes or forced perspectives. Sometimes, the most profound thing a husband can do is simply hold his wife's hand in the dark and let her feel the full weight of her reality. When we arrived at Longleaf Pine Drive, I helped her inside, poured her a glass of water, and watched as she went upstairs to change out of her ruined blouse. Standing alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary ticking sounds of the home we had built together over nearly 4 decades, I let the full magnitude of the evening settle into my bones. This was the exact kitchen table where Julian and Chloe had sat 3 years earlier to sign their initial business startup documents, while Eleanor served them homemade tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches as if they were still children. Julian hadn't read the paperwork carefully, and Chloe certainly hadn't either, They had been far too busy mentally spending the capital, flipping rapidly through pages and initialing wherever Marcus had placed little yellow sticky arrows. At the time, I had toyed with the idea of telling them to slow down and read paragraph 14, but I chose silence, believing I would never, ever need to pull that particular insurance policy. Paragraph 14 was a callable loan clause, granting me the legal right to demand the full repayment of the entire $275,000 principal balance within 30 days, at any time, for any reason, entirely at my sole discretion. But as Marcus and I had carefully structured it back then, that clause was only the baseline of our protection. Deep within the dense legal terminology of the commercial agreement sat an aggressive, highly specialized restrictive covenant, an exclusive commercial integrity penalty clause. This specific provision explicitly dictated that if Julian or his managing partner engaged in any public misconduct, scandalous behavior, or moral turpitude that brought public disgrace upon the enterprise and directly threatened the multi-generational reputation of our family name, the corporate veil would instantly pierce. Under the ironclad terms of that penalty clause, they would not merely face the accelerated 30-day recall of the loan. They would also become legally bound to assume strict, unlimited personal liability, risking their personal savings, vehicles, and private assets to pay heavy statutory damages. For 14 months, that document had gathered dust in Marcus's downtown office file cabinet, acting as a quiet, sleeping giant. But after what Chloe had done under the sparkling lights of King Street, and after what my own son had condoned with his cowardly applause, that document was wide awake. The trap was set, the terms were absolute, and when Marcus filed the notice on Monday morning, there would be nowhere left for them to run. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving efficiency of a well-oiled machine. True to his word, Marcus Hale filed the formal legal notice straight through the Duval County courts and dispatched an official, certified demand letter directly to Julian and Chloe's business address. The document was a cold, unyielding legal declaration enforcing paragraph 14 of their startup agreement, demanding the immediate, accelerated repayment of the entire $275,000 principal balance within 30 strict calendar days, alongside severe commercial integrity penalties due to public moral turpitude. To any sane business owner, receiving such a notice from a premier commercial attorney would have triggered immediate panic, legal counsel consultation, and a frantic scramble to salvage what was left. But Chloe was built entirely out of arrogance, blind entitlement, and an inflated sense of untouchable superiority. When the certified mail arrived at their office mid-morning, Julian stared at the heavy legal text with a face completely drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to comprehend the devastating financial reality of a 30-day cash recall. But Chloe snatched the papers out of his hands, let out a shrill, dismissive laugh, and tossed them carelessly onto the break room table. She was utterly convinced it was nothing more than an empty, desperate bluff, a cheap psychological trick orchestrated by an aging father-in-law trying to scare them into submission. Without hesitation, she marched over to her desk, dialed Marcus Hale's direct office line, and prepared to put the old dinosaur firmly in his place. Marcus picked up on the very first ring. Before he could even finish offering his standard professional greeting, Chloe launched into a tirade of aggressive mockery, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. She sneered that they wouldn't pay a single red cent, threatened to sue his firm for harassment, and warned him that playing legal games with her future empire would result in a devastating countersuit that would strip him of his license. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't interrupt her rant with excuses, and didn't offer a single word of debate. He simply listened to her screeching insults for precisely 45 seconds, let out a quiet, ice-cold sigh, and said with absolute cutting finality, "Mrs. Vance, your legal illiteracy is staggering, and your arrogance is entirely your own funeral. Do not call this office again." Before she could even draw a breath to scream back, he slammed the receiver down, cutting her off with a sharp, brutal dial tone. Humiliated and furious, Chloe refused to accept defeat. But instead of taking sensible defensive precautions, she doubled down on pure economic self-sabotage, driven by a frantic, unhinged desire to protect her personal lifestyle from what she still stubbornly viewed as a fake threat. She decided to launch a preemptive strike of her own. That very afternoon, while Julian was out in the field managing a minor client dispute, Chloe quietly utilized her executive signing authority to bypass the corporate security protocols. She marched straight into the corporate office, unlocked the physical emergency safe, and systematically swept out every single dollar of remaining operational cash, scooping up the last $42,000 in liquid reserves that the company desperately needed to cover weekly vendor payouts and upcoming payroll. With the stolen corporate cash burning a hole in her designer purse, she drove straight to a high-end luxury dealership on the edge of town. There, she proudly slapped down the entire stash as a massive non-refundable cash deposit on a brand new top-of-the-line European sports car, deliberately registering the luxury vehicle under her own private maiden name in a desperate, calculated attempt to permanently hide and dissipate corporate assets beyond the reach of any legal recovery. She walked out of that showroom grinning from ear to ear, fully believing she had outsmarted us all, completely blind to the fact that every single illegal, reckless move she made was digging her own grave twice as deep. She had chosen open warfare against a former commercial real estate attorney who didn't just write contracts. He wrote the rules of the game, and her time was already running out. While Chloe was busy parading around town in her newly acquired sports car and gloating over what she believed was a successful asset concealment, the actual foundation of her entire financial life was quietly imploding behind her back. For months, unknown to either Julian or myself, Chloe had been meticulously orchestrating a parallel exit strategy. Her ultimate master plan involved leveraging the substantial equity built up in their residential property on Cypress Ridge Court, the very house I had generously helped them purchase 3 years earlier by funding their $95,000 down payment. To Chloe, that money had always represented a free gift from an indulgent father-in-law. She had spent weeks consulting with a predatory local mortgage broker, arranging a high-risk cash-out refinance designed to strip $200,000 of fresh equity straight out of the home's walls, intending to siphon those funds into a private business venture she planned to control entirely on her own terms, separate from Julian. What she failed to realize, and what her mortgage broker catastrophically overlooked, was the ironclad legal architecture Marcus and I had established the day that house was bought. When I handed over the funds for the down payment, Marcus had prudently advised me to formalize it properly, not because I harbored any immediate suspicions of trouble, but simply because a disciplined former real estate attorney documents everything. That $95,000 assistance had never been recorded as an outright gift. Instead, it was legally structured as a deferred interest family second lien, properly notarized and officially registered with the Duval County Clerk of Courts. It sat quietly in the public land records as a legitimate encumbrance, waiting patiently for the exact moment it would be needed. The moment arrived with terrifying precision on Wednesday morning. As soon as Chloe's formal cash-out refinancing application was submitted to the institutional mortgage lender for final underwriting approval, their automated title search flagged the pre-existing senior-tier family lien registered under my name. Panic instantly rippled through the lender's risk assessment department, because the undisclosed lien severely compromised the loan-to-value ratio and exposed them to immense financial liability. The bank's legal compliance team didn't just reject her refinancing application. They took immediate, aggressive defensive measures. Within minutes of denying the $200,000 cash-out request, the institutional bank's risk department conducted a comprehensive review of all associated accounts linked to Julian and Chloe's social security numbers. What they uncovered was a nightmare. A commercial default notice filed under paragraph 14, an unauthorized corporate cash sweep, and severe red flags indicating active asset dissipation. Acting swiftly under their standard predatory lending and risk mitigation protocols, the bank invoked emergency clauses that went far beyond merely killing the refinance deal. They slapped an immediate, unappealable freeze on every single personal checking account, shared savings portfolio, and corporate-linked credit line standing in the joint names of Julian and Chloe. The financial annihilation was instantaneous and total. By Wednesday afternoon, when Chloe tried to swipe her debit card at a local boutique to pay for a celebratory lunch, the terminal flashed a rigid, humiliating error code. When Julian attempted to log into their primary online banking portal to check their balance, he was greeted by a stark, chilling notice of account suspension and $0 balances across the board. Every digital lifeline, every emergency reserve, and every accessible dollar they thought they possessed vanished into the ether. They were suddenly stripped completely naked to the elements, trapped inside an expensive home they could no longer afford, without a single cent in their pockets to cover basic groceries, buy gasoline, or even pay the upcoming utility bills. The very financial web Chloe had woven to trap others had suddenly snapped shut around her own throat, leaving her stranded in a nightmare of her own making, completely helpless as the walls finally caved in. By Thursday morning, the compounding financial destruction finally reached its inevitable, catastrophic peak regarding their business operations. For months, Julian and Chloe had staked their entire professional reputation and future solvency on the upcoming New Year's Eve gala at the downtown Hyatt Regency, a prestigious, high-profile mega-event that was supposed to anchor their annual revenue, satisfy their major investors, and cement their status in elite Charleston circles. But with all corporate and personal accounts completely frozen by the banks, And with the primary business emergency fund utterly gutted by Chloe's reckless $45,000 cash withdrawal to pay her initial legal retainer, they were entirely incapable of processing the massive upfront vendor deposits required to secure catering, lighting, entertainment, and staffing. Realizing the ship was sinking into an abyss, their jittery corporate clients panicked, rapidly pulled their contracts, and officially canceled their bookings one by one within a span of 24 frantic hours. Standing in the wreckage of their collapsing company, drowning in a rising tide of bounce checks and furious client emails, Julian completely unraveled. Desperate, terrified, and utterly out of options, he pulled out his cell phone on Thursday evening and dialed my number, hoping against hope that his retired father might pull a rabbit out of a hat and bail him out of the fire. When I answered, his voice was cracking with raw panic, breathless and trembling as he begged for financial intervention, pleading for me to call off Marcus, unfreeze the accounts, and rescue the gala contract from total oblivion. I listened to his desperate entreaties for a long, quiet moment, maintaining an absolute, unshakable composure. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I spoke in a voice entirely devoid of panic or anger, telling him with chilling calm that calm was precisely what real accountability looked like. That when a man stands by while his mother is publicly humiliated, the consequences that follow are simply the natural order of life. Hearing my cold refusal shattered whatever fragile restraint Julian had left, but the true emotional explosion was happening right there in their living room. Hearing him beg his father for money triggered a blind, rabid fury in Chloe. Realizing that the phantom fortune was completely gone, that the house was locked down, and that her luxurious lifestyle had evaporated overnight, she snapped entirely. Seized by an unhinged rage, she began screaming at the top of her lungs, grabbing expensive porcelain vases, decorative lamps, and framed photographs off the shelves and hurling them violently against the walls and hardwood floors, shattering everything in sight into a million jagged pieces. In her absolute drunken frenzy of malice, she didn't just curse Julian for his incompetence. She stopped caring about any remaining illusions entirely. She shoved her phone inches from his face, recording a venomous, hate-filled voice message, and screamed out loud the most brutal, unforgivable truth of their entire marriage. Standing amidst the storm of flying debris, Chloe openly and proudly confessed to my son that she had never, not for a single second, genuinely loved him. She mocked his weakness, sneered at his pathetic loyalty, and branded him directly as a completely disposable, brainless tool, a stupid, spineless instrument she had deliberately manipulated purely to use as a stepping stone to claw her way into Charleston's high society. In absolute chaos of the screaming match and the shattering glass, Julian, either through sheer psychological shock, trembling hands, or a subconscious, desperate desire for someone to witness the nightmare he had trapped himself inside, vividly left his phone call with me active, accidentally pressing the speakerphone button on his screen. Through the open audio channel of that trembling cell phone, sitting quietly in my home on Longleaf Pine Drive, thousands of feet away, I heard every single shattering crash, every hysterical scream, and every drops of venom word of Chloe's confession ring out with agonizing clarity. I sat in absolute silence in my living room, listening to my son's life get ripped apart by the very monster he had chosen over his own mother, and heard firsthand the ultimate soul-crushing confirmation of his betrayal. The last remaining threads of sympathy I might have harbored for Julian dissolved entirely into the cold, quiet night air. He had invited the fox into the henhouse, defended her teeth, and now he was forced to watch her turn on him with absolute, unadulterated savagery. The reckoning was complete, and there was nowhere left for either of them to hide. Realizing that her aggressive tantrums and emotional outbursts were completely useless against the harsh reality of frozen bank accounts and corporate defaults, Chloe quickly pivoted from domestic hysteria to calculated legal warfare. Desperate to salvage whatever dignity and hidden assets she could scavenge from the wreckage, she secretly retained a notoriously ruthless local litigator named Richard "Rick" Sterling, a courtroom shark known throughout Charleston for taking on shady, high-risk cases with a complete disregard for ethical boundaries. Working closely behind Julian's back, Rick Sterling immediately filed an aggressive countersuit designed to intimidate and overwhelm us through sheer legal muscle. But Rick fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. He assumed that Marcus Hale, despite his seasoned background, would buckle under the pressure of a multi-pronged civil assault. Instead, Marcus met their theatrical filings with the cold, unyielding precision of a master tactician, systematically dismantling their counterclaims clause by clause, using airtight corporate disclosures, notarized debt instruments, and ironclad bank records that left Rick's arguments exposed as baseless legal fiction. Seeing that standard civil motions were completely failing to shake our position, Chloe and her unscrupulous attorney decided to cross the absolute line into criminal territory out of sheer, unadulterated desperation. In a breathtaking display of brazen fraud and premeditated criminality, Rick Sterling orchestrated a forged document scheme, fabricating an official-looking amendment to the original business startup agreement. This fraudulent paper trail deliberately manufactured a fake, retroactive signature under my name, Thomas, falsely admitting to predatory lending practices and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Armed with this forged instrument, Rick filed an explosive, malicious addendum to the divorce proceedings, formally demanding that our family pay a staggering $500,000 in punitive damages for allegedly ruining Chloe's reputation and business prospects. The moment Marcus received the filing and subjected the signature to forensic handwriting analysis, the criminal nature of the plot became glaringly apparent. Marcus didn't even bother waiting for a scheduled civil hearing. He walked straight down to the Duval County District Attorney's Office and the Federal Postal Inspection Division, presenting undeniable proof of mail fraud, document forgery, and subornation of perjury committed by an officer of the court. What started as a bitter family dispute and a corporate default instantly morphed into a catastrophic, high-stakes criminal investigation that threatened to strip Rick Sterling of his law license and land both him and Chloe behind bars in a federal penitentiary. Julian, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to the criminal conspiracy unfolding right under his nose until the hammer finally fell on his domestic life. Just a few short weeks after the fraudulent lawsuit was launched, Julian walked through the front door of their Cypress Ridge court home after a grueling day trying to salvage what was left of his professional reputation, only to find his path blocked by a locked front door and a stack of heavy cardboard boxes piled on the porch. When he managed to force his way inside, he found Chloe standing coldly in the hallway beside a packed duffel bag containing every single one of his personal belongings. Without a single word of explanation or a trace of remorse, she shoved a thick, pre-printed separation and divorce agreement directly into his chest. The paperwork had been entirely finalized by Rick Sterling weeks prior, designed to strip Julian of any claim to the remaining property, saddle him with 100% of the accumulated legal debts, and cast him out like a used-up tool now that his utility had officially expired. Staring blankly at the woman he had sacrificed his own parents, his career, and his self-respect to protect, Julian finally realized the horrific truth. He had traded everything for a ghost, and the monster he invited into his home had just locked him out in the cold. The bitter realization of his complete and total ruin finally settled over Julian like a suffocating shroud as he drove his battered sedan away from Cypress Ridge Court, his entire life compressed into a single duffel bag thrown carelessly into the trunk. He didn't have a destination in mind at first, but his muscle memory and a deep, aching primal instinct drew him inexorably toward the only place on earth where he had ever truly been loved unconditionally. By late afternoon, his car pulled slowly into the familiar gravel driveway of our home in Mount Pleasant, the historic live oaks whispering overhead in the southern breeze just as they had throughout his entire childhood. He parked near the porch, cut the engine, and sat in absolute silence for several long minutes, staring blankly through the windshield at the house he had betrayed, paralyzed by a crushing wave of shame so intense it made it difficult to breathe. Before he even opened the door to step out into the damp evening air, Julian reached down to his left ring finger, pulled off the gold wedding band that Chloe had forced him to wear, and with a sudden, violent burst of raw anger and self-loathing, he rolled down the window and hurled the ring hard into a muddy puddle right beside the front steps, intentionally drowning the symbol of his blind, destructive marriage in the dirt and forever severing every remaining tie to his past mistakes. He pushed himself out of the car, his legs feeling like lead as he dragged his weary body up the wooden steps and stumbled through the front door, which had miraculously remained unlocked, a silent, enduring testament to a mother's perpetual hope. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft amber light of twilight, and the familiar scent of Eleanor's lavender soap and home-cooked tea drifted gently down the hallway. Hearing the fumbling footsteps at the entrance, Eleanor emerged slowly from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression transitioning from mild curiosity to profound, heartbreaking shock as she took in the sight of her broken, trembling son standing before her like a ghost of the boy she had raised. Without uttering a single defensive word, without offering any pathetic excuses for the horrors he had allowed to happen, Julian completely broke down, his knees giving out beneath him as he dropped heavily onto the hardwood floor of the kitchen, burying his face in his hands and sobbing uncontrollably as he crawled forward to press his forehead against the hem of his mother's skirt, begging for forgiveness in a ragged, broken whisper that tore straight through the silence of the room. For a terrifying suspended moment, Eleanor stood frozen in place, the dish towel slipping from her fingers as the decades of accumulated pain, public humiliation, and quiet heartbreak rushed back to the surface. I stood silently in the deep shadows of the hallway entrance, leaning against the doorframe with my arms folded across my chest, watching the profound drama unfold without interfering. I saw Eleanor look down at her kneeling son, her chest heaving as a complex storm of maternal grief, anger, and mercy warred within her soul. Slowly, trembling slightly, she reached down to place her hand gently on his bowed head to pull him up, and as her fingers brushed against his tear-stained cheek, the light caught her right wrist just right, exposing a faint, pale, jagged scar running across her skin, a permanent physical mark left behind years ago from a severe kitchen accident during one of her lowest, most lonely nights, a scar he had ignored and mocked by association when he sided with the woman who despised her. Feeling that old, forgotten scar beneath his fingertips as he clutched her hand, Julian let out an animalistic cry of pure, unadulterated agony, the realization that his blindness had literally scarred the woman who gave him life, driving him to the absolute brink of psychological collapse. Eleanor, looking down at that scar and feeling the genuine, agonizing weight of her son's total repentance, finally let her own tears fall, dropping to her knees on the kitchen floor right beside him and wrapping her arms tightly around his shaking shoulders, holding him close to her heart just as she used to when he was a frightened 7-year-old child having nightmares in the dark, standing quietly in the shadows of the hallway, watching my wife pull our shattered son from the wreckage of his own making. I felt the last lingering embers of my own bitterness turn gently to ash. I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel victorious. I simply felt the heavy, quiet certainty of a man who understood that true accountability is not about destroying your children, but about letting life strip away their illusions until only the raw, honest truth remains. Julian was finally home, but he was returning as a man forged in the fires of absolute consequence, forever changed by a reckoning he could never unlive. The wheel of justice does not turn overnight, but when it finally grinds down to the bedrock, nothing is left standing in its wake. Following the catastrophic collapse of her fraudulent lawsuits, the criminal exposure of her attorney, and the total evaporation of her high society dreams, Chloe found herself utterly stripped of every asset she had ruthlessly accumulated. The house on Cypress Ridge Court was forced into an immediate, devastating short sale under the watchful eyes of institutional lenders, wiping out every cent of equity she thought she had secured. Left with a mountain of unpaid legal fees, crushing corporate default penalties, and a federal fraud investigation hanging over her head like a guillotine blade, she packed whatever cheap luggage she had left and fled southward to Atlanta, hoping to hide her shame in a bustling metropolis where nobody knew her name. But karma is a meticulous accountant, and escape is never a true remedy. Within months of her arrival, the National Credit Bureau system permanently flagged her profile with an unyielding, cascading cascade of negative marks, freezing her credit score into a deep, inescapable negative vortex. When she attempted to lease a decent apartment in a respectable neighborhood, background check after background check rejected her applications instantly, leaving her trapped in a cycle of rejections, forced to scrape by in a rundown, roach-infested motel room on the gritty industrial outskirts of the city, a bitter, poetic fall from grace for a woman who once believed she was destined to rule Charleston's elite. While Chloe's manufactured empire turned to ash in Georgia, life back in Mount Pleasant began the slow, arduous process of healing under the warm, steady light of genuine accountability. Julian didn't get his old life back overnight because real recovery isn't a gift handed to you on a silver platter. It is something you earn one agonizing, brick-by-brick decision at a time. He accepted an entry-level position as an assistant project manager at a mid-sized construction firm downtown, diving headfirst into honest, grueling labor that left his hands calloused and his mind clear of illusions. He rented a modest, clean apartment near the Cooper River, far enough to build his own independence, but close enough to anchor himself where he belonged. True to his word, every single Sunday evening without fail, his phone would ring in our kitchen, and he would spend an hour talking to his mother, asking about her garden, sharing details of his projects, and rebuilding a sacred bond that pride had nearly destroyed forever. I watched my son transform from a spineless, manipulated shadow of a man into someone who could look people straight in the eye without a shred of shame, knowing that the fire he had walked through had finally burned away all the impurities. One crisp Saturday afternoon in late November, exactly 1 year after the nightmare on King Street had shattered our world, Julian drove over to Longleaf Pine Drive with a heavy-duty ladder and a brand-new, modern brass porch light fixture tucked under his arm, a direct replacement for the flickering, outdated fixture I had been meaning to fix for half a decade. Together, Working side by side in the warm autumn sunshine, just like we used to when he was a boy, we uninstalled the old battered metal casing and wired up the new light. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Charleston sky in breathtaking strokes of amber and deep violet, Julian reached up and flicked the wall switch. A bright, steady beam of warm light flooded across the porch steps, illuminating the ancient live oak trees my family had planted decades ago. I stood back on the weathered wooden boards, holding a cup of hot coffee, and looked at my son standing beside his mother on the porch. I finally understood the ultimate lesson life had taught me. A quiet man's silence is never weakness. It is simply a temporary restraint, a calculated pause before the truth steps forward to clean house. And when a quiet man finally decides to stop being quiet, he does it completely, permanently, without a single wasted word. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, karma always collects what it's owed. I'll see you on the next one.